ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion, at least in my opinion, is really the only one which counts. We've been treated to a number of really fine and thoughtful presentations. Most of the important words that were said today, I'm going to steal, put in my next book, and give no one credit for it other than myself. But having said that, now our program takes something of a turn, and we're going to have, shall we say, a couple of parts of this. And let me introduce the first. A few years ago, the Lachoicz family combined with CCSU to help the Polish Studies program. And as a result of that, we were able to do a number of things, but I think perhaps the most important is create the Lachoicz Fellowship to promote Polish studies among students at CCSU, especially those who are directly or indirectly interested in things Polish. And I'm very proud that our first Lachoicz Fellow is here among us, and and he's a nice fellow, he really is, and such a smart fellow. He's an outstanding student. And the first, Sean Koenig, will now make a few remarks. Sean?
Well, thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you to Dr. Biskupski for introducing me. And I'm truly honored to be the Lachoicz Fellow this year, and to be the first one it truly means a lot. And I'm just very appreciative of it all. So what I did is, with my research while I was in school, was I focused particularly on Germans in Wisconsin. And I got very interested. My family is from Wisconsin. We have roots through there in both the German and I think as well Polish population. And after doing my thesis, I got more involved in learning about Polish history and realized that there's so much more in Wisconsin besides the Germans. And interestingly enough, the Poles in Wisconsin are actually about the third largest minority group. And I'm looking in the late 19th century. And when you read narratives and histories of Wisconsin, usually they're dominated by that German narrative. And so what I wanted to do is uncover a little bit more forces about how these Poles were interacting with the other people around them in the state, and also how they were political forces in some of the really contentious political elections. And so just to talk a little bit about that entire areas. In the late 19th century, really the last quarter of the century from 1875 till 1900, the Germans were definitely a dominant minority. Of German-borns in 1890, they made about 16% of the population, and that doesn't include people who have parents, one or two parents of German descent, and that's just people who were immigrated straight from Germany. Of that group, and they were really split into two main groups, where their German identity was kind of this loose collection that was, they were all from a German area, so they were Germans, and that was kind of imposed on them by the American community. But really, they were much more diverse than that, but you can split them into two more groups of being really Lutherans and being Catholics. And during this period in Wisconsin, religion truly drives the political narrative. But then looking at Poles, and again, this is perhaps why studies of Polish peoples during this time are a little hard to follow and confusing, is because we don't have great numbers as to exactly how many Polish-born people there were in Wisconsin in, say, 1890. And part of that reason is when they recorded, where were you from, you would say, I'm from, you're Poland. They said, well, which part of Poland? So the recorders being, they're Prussian, or they're Russian, or they're from Austria or something like that. So the number is very low, where they only say about 1% of the population. Historians and also other Polish leaders during the time really think that this is so low that there really could have been almost 90,000 more Poles that are totally unaccounted for or misrepresented. And so instead of it being 1%, they really think it's closer to 7, possibly even almost 10%. This changes later on. By 1910, it's much more accurate, the way in which people are counted. It's much more based on what language you're speaking or what would be spoken at home by your parents. And so the numbers get very much better then. But by 1890, it's a little ambiguous as exactly the population. But nevertheless, looking through, I felt like there must have been a bigger contribution to this. And so what I did was really studying the historiography, was look into what was this Polish community like. Without a doubt, they were extremely Catholic, and that, again, in a time when religion really defines a large portion of people's identity, that's very important. And what's also very important is that they seem to be almost all Prussian Poles, as in they're coming from that German partition. And this actually has two interesting facets because it almost solidifies their own identity as Poles. Coming from an era, after German unification, there's the Kulturkampf. People are very much, your identity as a Pole and as a Catholic has been threatened in Europe. So when they come to America, they have a shared identity in that sense, where they might be from very diverse places within this partition of Poland, but they definitely have a shared experience and somewhat of a shared identity, which is very important as we go forward and looking at some of these the meaning of the church to the Polish community, because that's really the core of what people were built around. There's studies, particularly by Richard Zeitlin, Dariusz Kamieniewski, and Dennis Kolinsky, that focus on Poles in rural Wisconsin. And looking at these areas, they find that churches by far are the core of the community, where you could have an area with a few Polish farmhouses, but once a church is established there, suddenly people flock to that area. A great example that Kolinsky notes is there was already a parish established near Stevens Point in Wisconsin, which is a lot of Poles have settled there. And the church was unfortunately flanked by 3 taverns. And the pastor of the parish decided he's going to move the church about a mile east of the location, which totally upset the tavern owners, losing a lot of business. But what they saw is the entire center of that community shifted to follow the church. And to see that happen, and what really happens is when they open a school there, and when the school is open, you have people traveling as far from Milwaukee, which is a considerable distance away, just to send their children to a Polish school, Polish Catholic school. And that's just to illustrate really the importance of having the church in the community and what being a Catholic was to their identity. And to speak a little bit more about parochial schools, as they were another driving force in this point of Wisconsin history. Over 70,000 children were enrolled in parochial schools during this era, which moves us into a little bit more of my main point of focus on both the German and Polish sides of studying is in 1889, there was a law passed through the Wisconsin legislature that became known as the Bennett Law. And what the Bennett Law was at its core was really it was meant to combat child labor. It stipulated that children had to be in school for at least 12 weeks out of the year, and restrictions on how much children could work and minimum ages and things like that. And it passes through the legislature unanimously. There is very little discussion about it by either the Republican or the Democrat Party at the time, and it virtually goes through unnoticed. And when it is noticed, the population notices the main reason that it becomes a point of contention is it stipulates that a portion of the education has to be done in English. And this absolutely infuriates really all these minority populations, because most of these schools are German parochial schools, Polish parochial schools, Norwegian Lutheran schools, and a lot of the instruction, while was in English, the fact that it had to be restricted to so much of it being in English infuriated them because they were doing it in their local languages. And so what you see is a very volatile election year. That following year is elections for most of the representatives, but also for the governor. And whereas the Germans were split, again, as that Lutherans and Catholics, Lutherans almost always voted Republican, Catholics almost always voted Democrat. And in this election, the German Lutherans almost all voted Democrat. And it completely flips the narrative of Wisconsin politics. And so what I really wanted to do is take this a step further and say, what about these other groups? How are they affecting the election that year? And looking at polls, it was the same thing, where they, as Catholics, almost exclusively voted for the Democratic Party, but even more so in this election. People were going out in droves to show their support for the party that promised, the Democrats promised to get rid of the Bennett Law, whereas the Republicans stood by it. And so what you see is the polls almost become, again, already staunchly Democrat, but they go even to the next level. And this plays again a few years later in Milwaukee. A very similar thing happens where the polls, and this is really a lot of work done by Kate Foss Malone, the Polish people in Milwaukee were waiting to get water service connected. And they were really, their wards were the last ones to have the service connected. And essentially they were being ignored by their local political leaders. It was so guaranteed in the minds of the local Milwaukee that Poles would vote Democrat that no one even paid attention to them. If you read some of the newspapers, actually, it's kind of tremendous how dismissive they could be of that the Poles would abandon the Democrats. There were some rumors that said there's great expectation of the Republicans that there's dissatisfaction amongst the Poles in the 14th and 18th wards. But they're very quick to dismiss it in these newspapers, and that that couldn't happen. The Poles are going to stay where they are, voting-wise, and that the newly appointed sewer inspector said this morning that there had been some dissatisfaction, but it was all gone now, and this is only 2 days before the election. And what happens is instead of voting for the Republican Party for mayor and everything, the Poles just don't go to the polls at all. Whereas in 1892, in the local Milwaukee elections, 18,000 people had shown up from the predominantly Polish wards to vote. Just a year later, and when electing mayor, less than 4,000 came out. And that's very reflective of really calls by local Polish leaders to make their voices heard by kind of quieting down and not making their voices heard. By not voting, they voted in a much stronger way. And very quickly after that, they got water connected to the rest of their parts of the city. And so really the main takeaways to look at these things is, one, you have to understand that Polish identity in Wisconsin was very heavily connected to the Catholic Church. That was kind of a driving factor of their communities. They would, that's where your children may have been going to school, that's where your community organizations were, that's where, we just were talking about the fraternal organizations and things like that. That was very, very important to that. And really a lot of their political advice came from their local churches, where their pastors were, for the most part, very much Democrat, following that, typical linkage of religion to politics, and Poles definitely followed that. And it really, what it shows is, when you think about it, if the Poles acted almost always as this singular group, for the most part, they estimate about 90% of these Polish wards would vote together. There was not, they weren't split by any other issues. They voted together as Poles and as Catholics for whatever party, or in some cases didn't vote for that party. And if you think of it in terms of the relative size of their number, it really makes them seem more important. Again, the historiography of Poles in Wisconsin, there is certainly some, and it seems to be growing, but it's not as much as, say, the Germans or the Norwegians or the other larger groups. And if you think, if in 1890 there's 16% German-born people, well, that population is going to be split as far as political force, because half of them are going to be voting Republican usually, and half of them are going to be voting Democrat, and that puts it, very roughly at 8%. Whereas if the Poles, if they are actually at 7%, would be almost a considerable force to that. And so I think when looking at politics, particularly in this era, you have to acknowledge that there's so many groups vying for attention that each one could very easily tip the balance. In 1890, with the Bennett Law controversy, it was the German Lutherans who were able to do that. In 1893 in Milwaukee, in those local elections, it really was the Poles, by not voting, that are able to tip the balance. And so I think that Poles represent such a great political force that is almost totally undervalued, where a lot of study has been done about the Poles and their society and the development of their churches and different things like that, but their actions in politics has largely been just overlooked, because in a way they are a very safe bet during this era, that everyone knows what the Poles are going to do. But I think that fact doesn't make it less important to study it. That if anything, you should look more into that, is what are these driving forces? How much pull did they have with their local politicians? And so excuse me. It's interesting to look. There's a lot of the most historiography looks after that is Polish leaders kind of stepping up. But I think just based on my research that there are Polish leaders and pulling the citizens that aren't at the top, very recognizable. They're not, legislators or anything. They're just local leaders who are able to push and pull the politics of the time. And I really think that Poles particularly throughout all of Wisconsin, deserve a much more scrutiny in the entire election process. So thank you.
Keep it on my way. Sean, I'm proud of you. Yes. I'm proud of you. Isn't he a wonderful start to our program of Lachoicz Fellows? Well, Sean's really, I knew he was bright. I knew he worked hard, but I didn't expect that. And it's a wonderful start to the Lachoicz Fellowship that Sean is our first. But I'm glad to tell you that there is a second, and he is at work right now. So not only are fellows like Sean successful, but the program is successful, and I'm delighted that the Polish Studies program now can cultivate an interest in Poland and things Polish among the students. It's an area that is very important to our future and important to our university. Now, having said that, if you speak only in Polish, Sean will entertain a question, any question you might have. Please. Is there our question? Yes, ma'am, please.
What was the reason for the people to go to Wisconsin? In other words, was it just the farms? Were there a lot of factories as well? I don't know that much about Wisconsin.
It's a little bit of both. Particularly, I mean, Poles, for the most part, most immigrant groups really went for the urban centers because there was a lot of work in Wisconsin. At that point, it was mostly things like timber and a lot of processing and manufacturing. One big thing, especially again, those rural studies that I had mentioned, is the farmland and the good prices of the farmland reminded them of Poland, where they're out there kind of clearing the land, and in almost a romantic sense, they very much that appealed to them. But it certainly was very cheap. There were, again, some of these earlier communities that by, say, the 1870s, there were already those anchor institutions for people to go and visit. And for the most part, there's also a lot of advertising. As you also see with other groups, is people were writing home and were openly advertising, saying, like, there's terrific land here, it's very inexpensive, you get a very, fair shot at everything. And because Wisconsin has, by far, I think it's very much one of the most diverse areas during this era. It had one of the highest percentages of foreign-born people. So it wasn't just people from Poland who were going there. It was all different minorities, whether it be the Germans that were coming, the Norwegians, the Czechs, a lot of different groups. And so I think in a sense it was just open for almost anyone for these groups to go over. So.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I got two comments. One of them is I live in Milwaukee. I have for 35 years in Wisconsin. And it's hard to live in a place that long enough to found out something about it. I just want to say my compliments on an excellent job. Second, you mentioned at one point a pastor who wanted somehow to move his church away from taverns.
Mm-hmm.
And he would have to move to another city to do that.
Yeah.
Taverns were an ubiquitous institution in Milwaukee. There's about 2,000 of them in 1918. Every parish, in walking distance, you had the funeral parlor and you had the tavern. And that was just part of the culture.
It's tremendous when reading about that so they move it a mile to the east. It was a very rural area, so, and the tavern sued, and that they were taking away their business. And it was, a feudal lawsuit, but it does speak to that, where those are the people certainly had a lot of influence and power.
Any other questions or comments, please? Yes, sir.
Does the study include the entire state, or is the rural area or the urban area?
I tried to look at both to try and gain an understanding. Certainly the majority of the population is in Milwaukee and really urban centers. But there are these distinctly, what you notice is it's very enclavish, where people are all together. All the people of Polish descent are living in one area. So in a sense, it's somewhat easy to kind of find them and follow them. But there have, the studies have been in the rural areas, but then also Milwaukee. So I tried and took a little bit of a broader look without getting too broad to kind of, what are the similarities between those areas?
There was probably everybody remembers, there was
Yeah.
2016, right? Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was meant to be mysterious.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions, please? Yes, please.
In terms of going to Wisconsin, did people who were emigrating from Poland already have in their mind that this is where they go to, or did they land in New York City and there was some sort of response to them to go to Wisconsin?
A lot of people, particularly in this area, you almost, when you showed up, you kind of had a good reason of where you're going, and all the manifests have, destination. Where are you going when you land? And particularly Wisconsin, you do get a lot of people who that's their route. They're going straight there. I'd say it's probably the majority, actually. The other group, I think, is a lot of them were coming over, and more of their destination would be Chicago, which is still kind of growing at this point as a destination. But particularly where I research is just before 1900, is they're almost all coming from the German partition to Wisconsin, which is interesting because during this time, it's not people from from this partition who are only coming. It's from all of Poland, but the ones from the German partition are almost all going to Wisconsin instead of these other areas. And I think that is mostly because of advertising. People were writing letters home, and people were, it was a business to have, we'll help you organize everything. Absolutely. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Are there further comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I don't know if we can speak at all about the Polish community in Wisconsin, but it does go towards World War I. I can have a different question if that's not. I'm just curious about, during World War I, let's say Poles in Wisconsin, to express your patriotism as Americans, and then support for the Polish legions are almost, they're really at odds because Russia's our ally. And we haven't entered the war yet.
Right.
But once we do enter the war, it's on the side of Russia. But is there a conflict there between expressing your Polish heritage and then desire for the restoration of Poland and American, American patriotism, whatever, loyalty, but then there's our foreign policy?
I'm not going to, I don't think I could speak too much about the Polish side of it. I know particularly with the German side, that community in Wisconsin made great strides to express their patriotic. Most of the German newspapers stopped printing in German. They transitioned to printing in English as the war develops and as public opinion really goes against the Central Powers. But as far as the Poles, I couldn't say, without making something up, perhaps, that, as definitively about, their attitudes. Certainly they were it was an insular group. They had a lot of newspapers that were, in Polish and things like that were patriotic. But again, I wouldn't say too confidently either way.
Any further questions or comments, please? Right here.
How did you conduct your research? Did you have any obstacles in terms, for example, a language? Because a lot of resources from that time related to Polish community were in Polish. So how did you overcome that obstacle?
I was very fortunate that there were other people who had already done the work for me. As far as my secondary sources, as far as my primary sources, or even some of the secondary sources weren't Polish. And what I really did was go slowly, and I cannot say I have any real retention of the Polish language still, as I've worked through it little bits and pieces, but I was able to go into some Polish language newspapers that were very helpful, but also use, try and use as many sources as I could, so I was using a lot of English sources. It was very fun, though, to go to test myself in a sense of going into a Polish newspaper and, sitting there with translating and dictionaries and just, getting a sense of what's going on. And that was very helpful. It's amazing to get the sense of these people and their, their community. And I think, if I was only looking at English sources, I would have obviously left out too much, way too much.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I think that's the way that things are going now. The way that by 1910 is when the census actually changes how they identify people from where you're born or where your parents are born to languages that you're speaking. So that helps a lot. Also, the parishes are probably the best resource for finding a true number. There were some during the 1890s, there were some efforts by local Polish groups to do themselves, and that's where some of these numbers of 7% of there being over 100,000 Poles in the state at that point. And there's another way that actually you could find out a better population estimate. It's just escaping me. It's it is to go, if you were to go through they use names a lot, actually. It's when you go through census rolls, this is particularly useful, I know, when they do, for a lot of other groups, is sometimes you can just go through the census and look, say they're from, they have a Polish name and they're from Germany. It says they're from Germany, so they're probably not Germany, they're probably Polish. And it's not as precise an answer still, but you have to use a lot of different resources to find these things out. But parishes typically are one of the best resources, and again, that you're still depending on what kind of records their shape their records are in, as well as accessibility and whether there were any records to begin with.
Before I recognize our next questioner, I'd like all of us to look into the upper left-hand corner. Dr. Robert Wolf, our new Dean of Arts and Sciences, has been kind enough to visit us today. He has asked that each of us give him $10 to thank him for visiting us, but I'm sure he'll take 5. Dr. Robert Wolf, please. He's not a bad fellow, really. Mr. Zimmerman.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to ask if you use any repositories of the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison?
Yes. Particularly, online. They've done a great job of digitizing a lot of their work, particularly with the Bennett Law controversy. They have a lot of different things in several different languages of pamphlets that were distributed, different letters and from like candidates and things like that. There's a great one from the governor that he sends to a senator, and it's one of those letters that you send to be leaked, and it's all defending the praises of the Bennett Law and things like that. And in these, they do they describe each group. They're really trying to say like, oh, this law is terrific for for the Norwegian, for the Pole, for the Czech, and so they go through and you can see they're kind of putting feelers out, but it's mostly directed at Germans, particularly in that point. Yeah.
Is there a further question, perhaps? Yes, please.
Maybe I'm wrong. Wasn't that from Western Poland, the German petition, people immigrated first to Wisconsin, only later the Chicago became an magnet for Polish immigrants?
For the people coming from, my understanding from the German side is Wisconsin was a real destination. In Chicago during this period, it was much more the Russian, I believe. As things go further, it gets more evenly spread out, and it's really after German unification, when Poles are being threatened, they're both through their religion and their nationality, that you get a lot of that's when you see the large exodus. That's when the immigration from the German partition really happens. But throughout the whole period, you get from the other partitions, but less so to Wisconsin. By about 1900 is where you do see the influx, particularly again from the Russian partition. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Anything further? Yes, please.
If I could, the question sort of came up about resources available to study Wisconsin Colonial. To blow my own institution's horn, University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, a resource that's very valuable and it's available online if anybody should want to. It's a photographic collection that's undertaken by Roman Kwasniewski, who was sort of a photographer record of the Polish neighborhood during its heyday. And this consists of thousands of photographs, almost all of which have been digitized. And
Thank you. Anything further in this regard? In that case, Sean, thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
As is usually the case, ladies and gentlemen, people who are generous, both in spirit and their support, are often associated with shyness. Same thing with the Lachoicz family. However, Barbara Lachoicz-Cunningham, although initially said, no, I'm not going to speak because it's not always about the family, she's agreed whether she realizes it or not. Since this is the first premiere recognition on the program and of the generosity of the Lachoicz family, I think it's fitting she has agreed to at least get up and not only greet Sean, but also say a few words about the family generosity and the concern about the Polish heritage which she represents.
First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Okay, well, this is totally unprepared, but my parents came to the United States in 1951. Even back in England, which is where we wound up after World War II, my father was very much involved in setting up Polish classes for children in the different DP camps, working with the British government, as well as even at there's a teachers' college associated with the university in Edinburgh, Scotland. So now I'm getting nervous, so let me just take a deep breath. Okay. So they have a background where they were constantly working for the Polish cause way back in the late 40s and so forth. I myself went to Polish school in in England, so I didn't even know English when I came to the United States, but you pick it up in 3 months. So when they came to the United States, to Bridgeport, the first thing that my father did was set up a Polish school in Bridgeport, affiliated with, I think it was White Eagles or whatever. It varied where it was stationed. But he continued with that, and then finally, towards the end of his life, he taught Polish at Sacred Heart University. So I guess what best describes my parents is that Polishness was very, very important to them. It was important that people know about Poland, not just Polish people, but as he would say, second, third generation Americans who might have a drop of Polish blood in them, that there be a place at university level where they could learn about their heritage, be exposed to Polish ideas, Polish customs, Polish greatness. And so it really pleases me that there is a fellowship here that makes available to students monies that allow them to do further research and to learn about Poland and share it with us. So when my father wrote his autobiography, what he started it with was moje serce zostało w Polsce, my heart remained in Poland, and I guess that best describes them. So that's it.
I'm glad Barbara made a few remarks. I just like to add one small anecdote to that. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student at Yale, I was minding my own business, which will be on my gravestone. I was minding my own business, and I received a call that they would like me to teach a history of Poland course in Bridgeport at Sacred Heart University. And the person I dealt with was Barbara's father and Barbara's mother. And I got to know them, and they even came to some of my classes, which was very polite, certainly, and they were attentive, polite, and pretended that I was telling them things that, of course, they already know. But I remember your father very well, and what struck me about him is he was a dignified man, and he was a kind man. So it was an honor to know your family, And I'm again honored that you would participate in our program. Thank you. This part of our program I find particularly attractive and satisfying, and that is, as you know, one of our CCSU students just spoke, having received an award, and the spreading of knowledge and interest in Poland among college students is a fine thing. We're very proud of it. We're very satisfied by it. But there's also something that perhaps is even more satisfying than that, and that is the spread of the knowledge and appreciation of Poland in high schools. And therefore, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague from the library, Renata Vickery, who will explain this to you all. Renatka?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It is a particular pleasure for a librarian and an archivist to really work with young people and to share with them what we hold dear in the library and archives, because then my job has a sense when we have students, when we have people from the community, anyone who would like to expand their knowledge and come and use our resources. When we were talking about how we can celebrate, commemorate the 100th anniversary of Poland regaining independence, we were thinking about engaging also younger generations. We know that students do a particularly wonderful work, professors, researchers, but also we wanted to expand to a younger generation. And of course, we have a tradition working with local schools and especially with New Britain High School. That collaboration goes back to the beginning of the Polish Studies program in 1974. And this particular celebration that is so important to Polish history was an occasion to, again, think about engaging young students and collaborating with New Britain High School. And of course, we wanted to see what students would come up with, and we gave them a wide range of projects that they could be involved with. And this included a research paper, a PowerPoint presentation, poster board, and also a video. Unfortunately, video was not one of the choices. However, the papers and the PowerPoint and the poster board the students presented were very informative, were very interesting. And even for me, I consider myself pretty good in knowledge on Polish history. I could learn how young people research the material and what particular elements of the Polish history they were able to extract from the research that they conducted. And to really have this project come to fruition, it was my understanding that we have to reach out to the professors that really know how to inspire students. Myself and my colleague Ewa Woleńska, we reached out to the professor from the New Britain High School, Iwona Pruski, and we worked with Professor Pruski on many events in the past, and it was really a pleasure to have her and her students to really participate in this special project. And I would like to invite Iwona Pruski to come and to share how she was able to engage students and what kind of projects the students had. I would also like to welcome Dr. Cynthia Kasadak, who is the director of ESL and World Languages, who came here with the students and the students' parents, what I understand. So welcome, Iwona Pruski, please do come.
Good afternoon. For years, New Britain High School students have participated in many events organized by the Polish Studies program here at CCSU. This partnership allows high school students to experience what college life is all about. Thank you for giving them such a wonderful opportunity. I am very proud to be a part of this celebration. It was inspiring to see so many great projects. Although the students were required to work independently, I know that in many cases it was a family affair. The decision to select the winners was not easy. We trust that the prize money will be put to a good use by our students. Thank you.
So, right now, I would like to invite Dr. Biskupski, who temporarily disappeared, but he will be here in a moment, and Ivana Pruski. So we will call the winners, and we will give them the award for their hard work and very important work. Because I'm hoping that these students, if they decide to come to CCSU, at least they will either choose to study history as their major or at least a minor. Half an hour ago, we were listening to our student who graduated with the degree in history, and he was our first Lachoicz fellow, and he did absolutely outstanding job researching Poles in Wisconsin. So for you young students, there is a wide array of opportunities and possibilities to explore your Polish roots and Polish history and culture. So we are going to start with the winner, or rather winners of the competition. And I would like to call Elizabeth and Victoria Farrell, two sisters from New Britain High School. Ladies? And I don't know which one is Victoria. Victoria, here we go. Here we go. And congratulations. Ladies? He might be your future professor of history, so. I want to add that we not only collaborate with New Britain High School, but also with Polish Language Saturday School. And this is very important institution that really help us to keep the Polish language and the Polish culture and history alive. There is many people who support Polish Studies program, either came from the Polish Saturday School or sent their children to that school. So I am really pleased to announce the winner of the second place of the competition, Dalia Donor, who is also a student of Polish Saturday Language School. Daria? Dalia. Dalia. Congratulations. And we have also second prize that goes to a student from New Britain High School. Roxana Kosałka is the recipient of the second prize. Roxana, congratulations, and hopefully you're going to come here to CCSU. And the second prize. We have a third prize. We have two third prizes, and they also go to two sisters. I have to say that, you know, there is a great duo working in some families. Kamila and Claudia Sasiela, they are the winners of the two third prizes. Ladies? Can I close them? Okay. You know, for me, it's never enough when we just distribute the honoraria or the scholarships. I like to hear more what the students were engaged in, so I would like to quote what some of them said about the competition. Roxana Koszałka said, I decided to work on this project because I wanted to learn more about the country my home family is from. While completing my presentation, I constantly had to ask my parents or my brother many questions. Another person, Ella Farrell, stated, Polish history has been full of ups and downs, wars, breakthrough events, and inspiring people. I have such an admiration for Polish people to be able to go through such tough times. Klaudia Sasiela commented, I can only imagine how happy the Polish people felt on November 11, 1918. It was probably the very same feeling when the communist era ended. And her sister Kamila added, Poland is a strong and independent, and even though we went through a lot, we finally won independence and our place on the map. Thank you very much.